Hi everyone, this is Moon Young working in the Department of Education at Seoul National University. I'm served as an organizing committee member of 21st ICER. I'm very honored and happy to be a chairman for this main session. Considering the limited time, let me just introduce today's keynote speaker a little bit, but actually, I don't think I need to introduce this phenomenal scholar in detail, but the process is process. Understand my situation. And Professor Andy Hargreaves is director of Shenin. I'm not sure I pronounced correctly, but change, engagement, and innovation in education. Very attractive acronym naming at the University of Ottawa in Canada, and emeritus professor at Boston College and US. He is past president of the International Congress of School Effectiveness and Improvement, former advisor in education to Premier of Ontario from 2015 to 2018, and current advisor to the First Minister of Scotland. He has published more than 30 books and more 100 peer-reviewed articles. Today, he is going to give us a speech on student engagement. As far as I know, he introduced 5 FAST to enhance his student engagement, I think. And so we are very honored to have you here, Andy Hargreaves. Please give him a big round of applause. Okay. Did I miss your important career? If any, you can tell us, okay? It's your time.
Thank you, Professor Young. I hope everyone can hear me and that there is no echo. I really appreciate those introductory remarks, and appreciate too the comments, the opening comments of Professor Lee, Professor Shin, Professor Kim, Professor Yo, Dr. Yu, and Dr. Gan. This is the 21st ICER conference of the 21st century, and it comes at an extraordinary time, and I truly treasure this opportunity to be able to open it for you in this way with the first keynote address. Let me share my screen with you, and then we'll be able to see what comes. I realize there's still an echo on here, and if the technicians can do anything to remove that, not just for me, but for the other speakers, that will be enormously helpful. So, there we are. This is an extraordinary time. You don't need me to tell you that. The fact is not only are we still well in the middle of, or the second half of the worst pandemic in 100 years, but we're facing unprecedented problems of climate change and global warming, with fires and heating in California, in Southern Europe, in Australia, Africa, in India, floods in Europe, in Japan, in China, in many parts of the world. We're finding that the planet is already becoming uninhabitable, and the next generation, in some cases, is fearing it may well be the last generation. All this is running alongside, all this in the week before COP26 meets in Glasgow in the UK. All this is happening alongside the highest levels of inequality in 40 years, when half the world's wealth is owned by 26 people. Half the world's wealth on which few taxes are paid. And so the rest of us are scrabbling around for what remains. And this means that there is racism, there is Black Lives Matter, there is Asian hate, there is fear of people who are different and who threaten us. And because of all this too, there's a global crisis of democracy now. Only 8% of the world's nations, according to The Economist, are full democracies, as people in desperation are looking for strongman leaders to find solutions to these apparently impossible problems. It feels, in many respects, like the walls are closing in, with all these forces coming at us from different sides. And the way out, the pathway clear of this seems slimmer and slimmer. And so what does this mean that we should do in response to these multiple converging and not entirely coincidental crises that we face in our societies and in our schools? Well, after the Asian tsunami earlier this century, Bill Clinton and George Bush went to Southeast Asia to help build a recovery on behalf of the United Nations. And they invented this phrase that's become quite popular now, called Build Back Better. But by building back better after the Asian tsunami or any other crisis, they didn't just mean rebuilding schools or hotels or businesses or places of worship. They really meant that building back better was about building people back better, focusing on their well-being, promoting greater inclusiveness in the society, and reducing inequality, not just building society back, but building society back better. And what better, more important way is there to do that than by educating the generations of the future, by how we create the new generations, by what they're competent at, what they care about, what they commit themselves to. This is our job as teachers. We don't just teach maths and literacy, but we prepare the next generation and the things that will occupy their minds and the ways that they will respond to them. And in drawing on today's talk, I want to focus on, I draw on 3 or 4 different sources. The first is I am president and co-founder of a global organization, a movement called ARC. It used to be originally the Atlantic Rim Collaboratory. It's now broader. And this is a group of ministers and professional leaders in different countries. There are 7 at the moment who are members of ARC, who are committed to advancing a particular set of values, broad excellence, not just literacy, maths and science, but the arts, social studies, physical accomplishment, then inclusion, equity, well-being, democracy, and human rights in high-quality, professionally run systems. This is an organization that there's been an open invitation to South Korea to join, should it wish to do so at any time. And because in many ways you fit these criteria, this is the way you are seeking and striving to move, then we feel you make a powerful contribution to this group that has an annual summit and that during the pandemic has been meeting every 6 weeks or so to share knowledge, ideas, and expertise. So, for instance, our next meeting in just a few weeks, we'll be looking at how we can completely rethink examinations and assessments after the pandemic, taking the great opportunity of the disruption to examinations that we've had to rethink them in a creative and fulfilling way. Nations have learned from each other that they've offered different things and they've changed their policies as a result. So one of our countries, for example, invested many millions of dollars to ensure that every elementary school would have an outdoor learning space, not just an outdoor playing space, but an outdoor learning space, because we realized during the pandemic that one of the best ways to deal with socially distanced learning was by learning outside. And in that sense, nations then turned to the research that showed that learning outside is actually good for learning in general, rather than being indoors, practicing tests, being on screens all the time, for example. And another nation decided to give vocational education a policy priority, because when we shared expertise and insights, we realized that there is a major problem now in many countries with global supply chains, especially of scarce products. So more countries are now thinking about manufacturing closer to home, rather than goods coming from great distances across the globe. And if goods are manufactured close to home, this means a higher priority for manufacturing skills, vocational skills, not the old roll up the sleeves, hard sweat and labor manual skills, but high-tech, high-quality skills. So nations are learning from each other, and we've been learning from them about what the key issues are that we're facing during the pandemic and how we should respond. This is one of the organizations that we've been drawing upon. Second is I'm an advisor for the Scottish Government. There are 10 of us, actually, in total. Here's a picture of us. You may recognize some of the faces taken in 2019, just before the pandemic broke out. This is why no one is wearing masks in this picture. And at the end of 2019, we were asked as advisors, all 10 of us, to produce a report, to a think piece on a post-pandemic strategy for education in Scotland. And here are just 6 of the provisions. We talked about the need for systems to be designed, universally designed, so that they could work well in a pandemic and work even better outside of a pandemic, be able to respond to both. For that to happen, we said, number 2, systems need to be less bureaucratic, less centralized, more responsive to their local circumstances, to changes in circumstances. We saw during the pandemic how some of the best solutions early on came from teachers locally with their own schools and with their own communities. So we need more agile, more flexible, less bureaucratic, less slow, less hierarchical systems to respond to crises like pandemics or climate crises, but also to be effective when there isn't a pandemic. Of course, we talked about there being more digital, more universal access, as there is pretty much in South Korea, but not in all countries, to devices, to platforms, to Wi-Fi access, and for this to be a routine part of the system that people are in. But as well as more digital, more physical learning, more outdoor learning, more learning in nature, more learning with nature, less time in the building, more time out of the building. Something else we've learned from the pandemic. When students for 2 years in many other countries were not able to take tests or examinations and entered university on the basis of teacher judgments, we said this was a huge opportunity, which many countries are considering now, for the first time with higher education, to rethink qualifications, to rethink examination criteria, to rethink what we want our young people to enter universities and higher education with. And last but not least, we said that during this pandemic, during all crises. Not only do young people experience a lot of stress and their teachers, but leaders experience great stress too. So we need to make sure that all our leaders have professional support, coaching, mentoring to help them through these very, very difficult times of critical judgment. And as a result of this, Scotland introduced a policy of a coach or a mentor to be available for every leader who needed one within the system. So these are some of the things we gained by working with one particular system in more detail. And then this summer in the Northern Hemisphere in Canada, a group of us were asked by the Royal Society of Canada, a very prestigious organization like the Royal Society of Arts in the UK, if between us, among health specialists, mental health specialists, psychologists, curriculum and teaching specialists, we could help the country think about what the impact of COVID-19 was on children and schools, how we should respond, and what we should do as we come out of COVID-19 into a world that isn't quite like the world we knew before. And amongst the many provisions that we set out, one of them was this, which is very important now, that many countries, many people, many educators, many governments are saying the most important thing as we come out of COVID-19 is dealing with what's called learning loss. So with learning loss, people worry, according to test scores or examination scores, what young people have lost in their learning compared to where they might have been had there not been a pandemic. They argue that we need to keep testing in order to identify these losses, and we need very specific, precise interventions to compensate for them. But we feel in our report, and we're not the only ones, that this is fundamentally a wrong direction to take. Of course, many children have lost a lot during the pandemic, but to conceptualize this only as measured achievements in literacy, mathematics, and science, say, is really a very disturbing direction for countries to take. And the reasons for this are as follows. First of all, it takes a very narrow view of what is achievement. And by taking a narrow view and putting extra emphasis, extra time in young people's already busy lives with after-school hagwons and so on in places like Korea, that when they return to school, it will be miserable because they'll be spending even more time catching up, more time on basic skills, more time on practice, more time on trying not to be behind. So they'll end up wishing they'd never gone back to school in the first place. The second thing about this emphasis on learning loss is, of course, it relates to an outdated and irrelevant standard, which is where the learning targets were before the pandemic. And this is rather like saying to people climbing that they have to climb a rock face, and they have to climb a rock face as fast as the people climbed the rock face yesterday. But when they're doing it, they also have to do it in bad weather, whereas the people yesterday climbed the rock face in good weather. The standards really, those standards, content standards, no longer apply in exactly the way they did. The third thing is people say if we don't compensate for learning loss, if we measure where people's skills are, economies will suffer around the globe. But this is really, again, a false argument, because we've seen after major world wars, for example, when children have lost lots of schooling, within 20 or 25 years, as that next generation has moved forward, their economies are actually often booming. So this too is a mistaken argument. And last, actually during the pandemic, some children have gained things. Some children have learned to be more self-determined, learners rather than always waiting on the teacher's direction. Some children have learned to be outside more rather than always playing games on the computer or sitting in front of a machine or practicing for tests and examinations. Some children have learned a lot from their families and from their parents when they've had to spend much longer times home with them, perhaps cooking, perhaps hobbies, perhaps repairs, perhaps another language. And so the issue we feel in our report after the pandemic should not focus on achievement and on learning loss, but rather on getting children re-engaged with their learning, re-engaged with the love of learning, re-engaged with their peers, with their friends, with their community, and having a sense of belonging again. Engagement and fulfillment, we feel, should be the priority, not achievement and learning loss. And the reason we say this is that engagement, we feel, following the research, is the lever into learning. So it is possible to learn without being engaged in your learning, of course, just by hard work, by grit, by resilience, by grim determination, by putting your head down and suffering and getting through it. It is possible to succeed. But the more disadvantaged your home circumstances are, the harder it is for grit and resilience and dogged determination to get you through alone. And we know from the figures in Asia, in countries like South Korea, places like Hong Kong, nations like Japan, that this extreme achievement orientation at all costs can create mental health problems and worse, and can lead, as it's done with the Japanese, to the point where when young people do get onto university and have finished their exams, they don't want to learn anymore. They want to escape from learning and into all the other parts of life they'd have to sacrifice to get into, for instance, the Sky universities within South Korea. So engagement is the lever for learning, and it's a window into well-being or the lack of well-being. If your students aren't well, it's usually an indicator of one of two things. Either there's something amiss or wrong with their home life, with their family, with their health, with things going on outside school, or with bullying, or with their friendships, for example. Or it's an indicator that something is adrift, is out of order with their instruction, with their teaching, that's not meeting the ways that they learn. So engagement is a lever for learning and a window into well-being. And the truth is that while teachers around the world became very concerned during the pandemic about their students becoming disengaged, about walking away altogether in some cases in many countries, from learning, from school, from everything. In other cases, they may have been online, but they switched off or turned their cameras off. They tuned out, they turned off, they walked away. And teachers worried about that a lot. But the truth is, even before the pandemic, there were signs in many cases that particularly high school students were already becoming more and more disengaged from their schooling. In America, the estimates are up to 50% of high school students are disengaged from their learning. In other countries, OECD data indicates it's somewhere between 20 and up to 40%, depending on the country. But even at the lowest levels, if 20% or 1/5 of our students are disengaged, that's a serious loss for them. And it's a serious loss for the society as well. So our job now, after the pandemic, is not only to re-engage students we've lost during the pandemic, but is also to engage many of the students for the very first time, who've never truly, at least in high schools, been properly engaged in the first place. So this is really the first half of what I wanted to talk about, or the first part. And in the remaining 15 minutes, I want to show you a bit where our concern with engagement came from and what it means and how it might help us beyond the pandemic. So this year, my colleague Dennis Shirley and I from Boston College have published two books. The second is almost out next month on well-being in schools. And the first is on 5 paths of engagement. And these books come out of 7 years of research with 10 school districts in Ontario in Canada, and the efforts of those districts and the government to improve equity, inclusion of all students of different identities and special needs, and so equity in inclusion and really paying attention to students' identities as well as a basis for their achievement and for their well-being. And we also have been researching again for about 7 years, a group of schools across 5 US states that received a federal grant to try and improve achievement for poor students in isolated rural schools by getting the schools to work together. And what they focused on, not us, so their choice of focus was they felt the best way to raise these students' achievement in these isolated communities was increasing their engagement with their learning, with their communities, and with the path that they wanted their life to follow over time. So we followed them. They didn't follow us. We followed what they were interested in. We looked at how they tried to engage their students, and we read a lot of the literature on student engagement. And the literature is dominated really by psychological perspectives, and they tell us some things, but not everything. So from the psychological perspectives, you really get this consensus that there are 3 components to engagement. I'd probably add a fourth. Engagement is partly emotional. It's how passionate you are, how enthusiastic about learning and teaching, or how bored you are by comparison. Partly it's cognitive. It's how curious, how intensely focused, how much you concentrate on what it is that you're learning. And the third part is behavioral. Are you there? Are you not there? Are you asleep? Are you awake? Are you keeping your eyes focused on the teacher or letting your attention drift elsewhere? And I'd probably add a fourth to that literature, which is a spiritual component as well. And a spiritual component isn't necessarily religious, but it's experiencing learning in a way that moves you in relation to your moral purposes and feeling part of something bigger than yourself, perhaps a religion, perhaps a community, perhaps a society, perhaps nature. And so these are really the psychological dimensions of student engagement. They're all important. And the more you can engage students on all these elements, the more successful you're likely to be as a teacher. And then we looked at really some of the major psychological theories that had actually had some practical impact within school. And I'll just share 4 of these with you very quickly. And it's nice to perhaps reflect on yourself when you've experienced these. So Maslow's hierarchy of needs, for example, from the 1940s, focus not just on safety and security, but on self-actualization. So are your students experiencing self-fulfillment, self-actualization through the curriculum, feeling that they're transforming themselves as human beings, not just learning and memorizing content to move on to the next level? Also in the 1940s, Harry Harlow, through his experiments with monkeys, invented the concept of intrinsic rather than extrinsic motivation. He set tests for monkeys to see what rewards, what food would incentivize them to complete the tests. But by accident, he discovered often they were not motivated by the external rewards. They were just motivated by how interesting the tests were, how creative, how unusual. And so this was what he called intrinsic rather than extrinsic motivation. And again, a question to ask is, how much are your students intrinsically motivated? How much are you intrinsically motivated to do the things that you feel are important? A third is Mikhail Csikszentmihalyi's concept from the 1980s and 90s of flow. A flow is the feeling that you are so intensely involved in something because it's very challenging and it's very interesting to you at the same time that you lose all track of everything around you. You forget to eat, you forget to sleep. You lose a sense of time going on and don't realize you're going to be really late for another appointment. We can't live in flow all the time. If we're in flow all the time, we'll drown. But all of us need to experience those moments of flow when we're doing something really challenging that is intensely interesting at the same time. How much do students have those moments of flow? At least every month, perhaps every week. How much do you have those moments of flow as a teacher, a professor, a researcher? And last is the concept of mastery. Now, we best know mastery from Benjamin Bloom in the 1960s and 70s, and his concept of mastery learning, which is incrementally going through levels of proficiency to reach greater and greater competence. But the organizational theorist Peter Senge added another dimension to the sense of mastery, and that is taking on very difficult and challenging tasks to reach levels of accomplishment that are so high they pose fundamental challenges to the self, to mastery of yourself, as well as the thing that you're mastering. This is what we mean when we talk about a master athlete. A master craftsperson, somebody who paints a masterpiece in art. When do you experience these moments of formidable mastery? When do your students, how do you help your students to experience those transformative moments of great mastery in their learning? These are some of the things that the psychologists tell us are essential to engaging students. And so if we just go off and learn all these, why is it that levels of engagement aren't increasing? In fact, they seem to be declining. And the reason for this is if you stick with the psychological theory, the theory in action behind it is if teachers aren't getting their children engaged, it's because they don't know how to, or they're not trying hard enough. We believe, working with our teachers in the schools in the Pacific Northwest, that most teachers already know how to get their children engaged. They don't come into teaching to turn light bulbs off. They come into teaching to turn light bulbs on. But things get in the way of teachers getting their kids engaged. So teachers get distracted. They focus on the wrong things. In a rock and roll phrase, in English, they lose their mojo that they once had. What are these things that get in the way? And what do the opposites of them look like? And this is how I want to close for the last few minutes today. On the left are what we call 5 enemies of engagement. And here, alongside the sociological perspectives, we put more psychological perspectives. We put more sociological perspectives about what's going on in the organization, in the school, in the system, in the society that's making it difficult for teachers to get their children engaged as much as they would want to. And way through the literature and through experience with the schools, we've identified 5 of these. And you might want to think about how they apply to you, to your schools, to the things you're researching and your practice. First is disenchantment, which means literally loss of enchantment or loss of magic. This originally comes from the work of the German theorist Max Weber. Here, teachers had the magic, but somebody stole it from them. And the thing that mainly steals the magic is standardized testing, is high-stakes assessments, is examinations, and is a standardized curriculum. So all the creativity and magic goes out of the curriculum, and students just put their heads down and get disengaged from the deeper learning that would otherwise be available to them. The second is disconnection. Here, the curriculum is a set of contents to get through, to learn for examinations or for university. It doesn't really seem to have any connection with young people's lives, with their interests, with their communities. This is important when we talk about social class differences and social class cultures, for example. It's important when we think about issues like gender. It's important for children who have special needs. They have abilities and disabilities. How does the curriculum connect with what they have and is not just experienced as difficult because of what they're missing? So the second is disconnection. The third is disassociation, which is lack of attachment and belonging. This happens when our schools are very competitive, when they become very individualistic, when students compete with each other, when they have no time to be together, whether they're either in after-school extra tuition or they're sat in front of a computer doing gaming, for example. So how do we build attachment and belonging in our schools more effectively? And how do we build the right senses of belonging so that students come to feel they belong not only to students like them, but also to students who are different from them in their own community and in other communities? Fourth is disempowerment. Teachers don't like to be subjected to random bureaucratic impositions imposed on them from above. Ask anybody in your teachers' union and they'll tell you. They certainly told me. And the same is true for students. However well meant the curriculum is, students don't always like the curriculum feeling as if it is random impositions that come from nowhere with no clear purpose. Where does calculus come from? Square roots, quadratic equations, the various wars around the world at different times. What is the purpose of these things? Why should they be learning it? People are telling me that during the pandemic, they've had to think harder about explaining the purpose of what's being learned to their students. And we need to take that learning back with us into the regular classroom. The best schools that I go into are ones where I can ask any child of any age, what are you learning and why are you learning it? Not just because it's to pass a test score or to get an examination result or to move on into university, but intrinsically, what is the reason for what they're learning? Do they have any voice in choosing what they learn and in choosing the way that they learn it? And how do we develop that voice amongst our students over time? And the last is distraction, particularly digital distraction. We know from the United States, the revelations, that Facebook has deliberately addictive algorithms that harm children. There's a TED talk from a former employee of ethics, responsibility for ethics at Google, who basically describes the people at Google as digital Frankensteins because the algorithms that get people to stay on the websites, including many children, are actually derived from the gambling industry. Americans check their phones 76 times a day. I walk around cafes and parks in America, Europe, and South Korea, and I see parents put their small children on iPads while they swipe through their phones and check their messages. Adolescent girls in England enhance their Instagram images 30% of the time. And we know these issues occur in South Korea as well, especially in relation to K-pop stars, for example. So how do we not just embrace more and more technology, but how do we have a thoughtful relationship to technology that embraces its benefits, but also deliberately identifies and minimizes the risks? These are the 5 enemies of engagement. And the opposite of them, I've already told you, but I'll just show you some pictures to close. And they are, how do you bring more creativity and magic into the curriculum? How do you make it joyful? How do you make it exciting? Not just for young children, but for all children. How do you connect the meaning and purpose of the curriculum to young people's cultures, to their interests, to their identities, to what is important in their life? This doesn't always mean following students' interests, because a teacher's job is to introduce students to new interests as well. But whichever it is, meaning and purpose is really important as a way of engaging our young people. How do you develop senses of attachment and belonging? And one of the ways you do this is through informal time as well as formal time. How are students involved in the curriculum? In schools that we've seen, students with mental health issues actually sit on the mental health committee within the schools. The government has a group of students who are policy advisors for the government, feeding back what impact the policies are having in the schools. So how we develop these senses of attachment and belonging, and related to that, senses of voice and involvement at the same time. How do we make sure that teachers collaborate with students and don't just collaborate with other teachers for students? And last, engagement isn't always fun. It isn't always easy. It's not always exciting. Sometimes it's hard. Sometimes it's challenging. Climbing a mountain is not always enjoyable. I do a lot of that, by the way, with Dennis Shirley amongst other people. Learning a musical instrument is not always enjoyable. There is sacrifice. There is suffering. So too is there for Olympic athletes. And so, as well as enjoyment, creativity, meaning and purpose, as well as all these things, we have to not just let students have fun, but have it lead to focus, to mastery, to being highly accomplished in something at a level that is so powerful. Young people will lose all senses of time, just like these students are doing, building a hydroponics kit so they can grow local vegetables in their distant community rather than having them flown in from a great distance. This is a time of immense crisis and challenge and opportunity. You will remember this time forever. Your children will remember this time forever. How do you want them to remember it? Do you want them to remember it as a time of despair, of loss, of lack of hope, of returning to grinding examinations, more standardized tests, further time spent in hagwons? Is this how you want them to remember it and to remember you? Or do you want your children to remember this as the time when together you decided that their experience of schooling and of learning and of life beyond it would not be disengaging, but engaging. And in changing themselves, they would change the world and mean that all these 5 crises would disappear or dissipate in significance over time. The secret is engagement. Go back to your schools, back to your university, and figure out how to develop more of it. Thank you for your time and good luck with your conference.
Give him a big applause. Andy, do you have time to deal with one question from floor? How about
Of course.
Andy? Okay. 최진이 is give a good question. So what is your expectation to South Korean students to join and contribute to ARC's activity, particularly, Korean students under massive competition like academic pressure? So what is your advice on that?
First of all, the people who join ARC at the moment are governments. So it needs a government to decide that they want to join ARC, and a minister signs a contract and forms a team, a small team of usually a minister, a senior civil servant, and a professional leader. We are now thinking about ways of involving students, as well as involving other groups. We've been going for 5 years. So I'd say we welcome South Korea to join. We'd love to hear from you. And we'd love, I'm sorry, we'd love to hear your ideas about what you can bring. And not only how you can join ARC, but how you can change ARC at the same time. I think one of the ways in which we will make learning more engaging for everyone is not only what teachers bring to the table after COVID-19, but what students bring. Because students have learned at home, many, that they can be more self-determined, that they can walk around more at home instead of having to sit still. And when they return to their classrooms, let's think what the furniture looks like. Let's think if you can have stand-up desks. Let's think if you can have sit-down beanbags. Let's think if you can have breakout rooms within the classroom, just like you do on Zoom, for example. So I think we have more chance of changing how engaging our schools are if students become a movement for that, as much as teachers and governments and researchers becoming a movement for that too.
Okay, thank you. Considering the limited time, I have to quit this session quickly. I really appreciated your effort and your interesting topic and contents for us. So thank you for your considering this ICER 21st ICER. So I'd like to announce that this is the end of the keynote session. Thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of 21st ICER. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.